Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. I was given 30 minutes to speak. I will try to give you a connection. It was interesting for me to sit in the audience because during my early career, I also studied hard science, and innovation is very close to my heart, but I'm not involved in that. But nevertheless, I will try to connect the economic imperative and the issues what Sri Lanka is going through, giving you some context of why this economic crisis happened to you, and kind of laying out some kind of framework how to think about how coming out of this crisis. Before I delve into this, I was amused to see that from the 10 contestants, there was only one boy. There were 9 girls basically, which is also a very good sign because one of my slides will show that the female labor participation in the economy is very low at something like 35%. The male labor participation is like 70%. So we need to get more of the females into labor force, and on the higher education, if there is such a high representation from the females, let's hope that they have a very productive career going forward, because that is what our current crisis is going to require. I have a lot of slides here, so I'm going to speak a bit fast to give you a context. I will keep the slides with the organizers, and you can connect with me if you have any questions of this conference, because I have another meeting, but my colleague Azel will be here for the panel discussion. So let's give you some context in understanding how did this economic crisis happen to us, because that's very important. So there were three reasons why this crisis happened to us. First reason is the misallocation of resources. So in economics, we think of prices, it signals the scarcity value of resources. So when there is less of something, the price should go up because it encourages demand to come down and it encourages more supply to come up. One of the key prices in the economy is the rate of interest. So during COVID time, they kept the interest rates extremely low, which means that they made money very cheap. And therefore, it doesn't encourage people to save, and it encourages people to spend more because you can borrow at fairly low interest rates. The next thing that they did was they kept the Sri Lankan rupee at a fixed exchange rate. It was not supported by the central bank, but through what is called moral suasion. They said, "Thou shalt not exchange the Sri Lankan rupee for a dollar for more than 200 rupees." So you can see that there's almost a perfect line during that COVID period, which is anomalous because this is a market determined thing and there will be some volatility. The next is that your currency then subsequently significantly depreciated, something like 85%. But something called the REA, which is adjusted for inflation differentials between countries. So the line at the bottom that you see is the Sri Lankan rupee relative to the US dollar. It's an inverted scale. And the something called the NEA, which is called the nominal effective exchange rate, is your Sri Lankan rupee relative to a basket of currencies which are weighted to the trade basket of your country. So that will include the Indian rupee and the yen and the euro, etc. So the level of depreciation has not been as high as versus the US dollar because the US dollar has been very strong globally. The other line that you see, which is called the REA, is adjusted for inflation differentials between countries, because what basic economics tells you is that it should be the law of one price between countries. And what's happening is the currency is actually appreciating because we are running at something like 50% inflation and our neighbors are running around 10% coming down. So this inflation is expected to come down significantly from the second half of the year because the statistical base started increasing during the second half of last year. But what we may have perceived that our competitiveness increased has actually now slowly eroding away. The next thing that we completely distorted was energy prices. Energy is the single biggest import that comes into this country. And our foolish politicians who seem to think that they can administer energy prices kept the price of energy at artificially low levels. And what this graph is showing you is over a period of 20 years that actually in real terms, which means that the nominal prices adjusted for inflation, the cost of petrol and diesel came down in Sri Lanka relative to 20 years ago until you had a significant adjustment where they had to make fuel prices more market determined. The next is I'm showing you the price of fuel relative to the price of fuel in India. Now, India's per capita income at that time was about 40%, 30% lower than Sri Lanka. We were close to 4,000, they were around 2,300. But the price of fuel in India, which is a much poorer country than Sri Lanka, is significantly higher than what it was in Sri Lanka. So again, I'm asking the question that if prices reflect the scarcity value of a resource and energy is one of your largest imported products, how can you allow it to be misallocated? You should price it so that it is a very scarce resource and you will use it efficiently. And I show my point like this. These three graphs basically show you petrol, diesel, and electricity consumption. There are two lines here, one showing you a 12-month period in the heart of this crisis. The other line, which is more flat, is showing you 4 years ago, just prior to Easter, which was Easter bombing 2019, which was a more ordinary period in Sri Lanka. And you can see that the more recent line is for a period before the crisis broke out in April is significantly higher than what it was 4 years ago, which was a very normal economic period. This is all indication that demand was too high in Sri Lanka. And you can see that even petrol, even at that time the shortages had started towards the end of 2021. The demand here, monthly demand, is far exceeding what it was 4 years before. Look at electricity. There were power cuts going, but the demand was excessive, right? So again, indication that when you keep prices too low and they are not reflecting the scarcity value, people are over consuming, right? So quite literally, we had a great party. And this is the electricity price. For over 10 years, it didn't adjust the electricity price. Again, it's a large item. Electricity, the turnover in the electricity market prior to the crisis about 300 billion rupees, right? So the electricity price, the cost was higher than what they were charging. For such a long time, you can see that it is flat revenue per unit, but the cost is going up. So again, you're not passing on the cost increase to the consumer so that they can be more efficient with their usage. You're continuing to keep it flat and having huge losses. So again, you're encouraging people to overconsume. The next shows you milk powder. That was one of the first items that went shortage. Bottom is the world market wholesale price of New Zealand milk powder. It's going up. We are keeping prices constant, basically. So what do you think is going to happen? These are private companies operating. Obviously, they're not going to sell at a loss. And that's how shortages started coming. And milk powder was one of the most visible items that went out of the market. Price controls on milk powder saying that it is a basic essential thing, but it's the worst thing for consumer because basically you will get shortages. Now what has happened today is there are no shortages, but people can't afford. What we had before is the prices were kept low, but shortages. So because the market is not finding its equilibrium point between demand and supply, if you allow a free market to operate, you will never have shortages because the prices will go up and demand will come down and there will be a huge incentive for a supply response. The next thing that we did is we reduced taxes. But we were reducing taxes not from early 2020, but 20 years before. And this shows you the growth of the economy over a period of time. The top is the nominal GDP, which is adjusted on an index of 100. And you can see that the GDP is growing, but taxes are not keeping up with GDP. So something is not going right. That there are parts of the economy that seems to be driving economic growth that is not being taxed. And there are parts of expenditure that is also not keeping up. And this is what you call primary expenditure, which is removing interest and trying to see. And most of this is, social spending, which is going into education and healthcare and some other transfer benefits. They're not keeping up with the growth of the economy. So the social welfare state that we call the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka is not a socialist state. That we are continuing to underinvest in these social welfare programs because first of all that the economy is growing but your taxes are not keeping up, which should not happen. Normally when the economy is growing very well, the taxes should be speeding up. It's called the tax buoyancy effect, faster than the economy. And you can see that this is a graph showing you relative to GDP. and you're running these large deficits called primary deficits, which is basically your total revenue minus expenditure without interest. So the concept of a primary deficit is to talk about what a finance minister can control, because he gets a certain revenue and there is expenditure which he can control. Interest he can't control because it's on debt that he has accumulated. The third thing is there was a complete failure of institutions in Sri Lanka. This shows you a graph of over a long period of time. The colors designate political parties, and the most important minister in any government is a finance minister. There are no full-time finance ministers in Sri Lanka. It's either the president or the prime minister is the full-time finance minister. Now, the finance minister is the least popular minister in any government because he is trying to tax people and hold back expenditure. It cannot be done by the leader of the country. And so when you don't have a proper person right at the top managing finances, what do you expect? The next thing is a central bank. They are the people who keep soundness of money, basically. You had politically appointed people becoming governors of central bank. You had one professor, emeritus professor of economics, who went around saying that money printing doesn't create inflation, basically. The second man comes from parliament straight to the governor of the central bank, which is a complete no-no. So then you had the famous fertilizer policy. That fertilizer policy is being dictated not by agriculturalists, but everybody, whims and fancies, having opinions on this which are hardly scientific. So your institutions in your democracy are not functioning. And to me, these are the three reasons why this happened to us. The third is that we have a mountain of debt. Now, we have a lot of debt. This slide is fairly dense, and I'll leave it behind for anybody, showing you who we owe this debt to. The debt is not only in the central government. There are a lot of guarantees given by the treasury. There's also SOE debt, which is a large amount. So it's a combination of a lot of debt, and this debt is something like 120% of GDP. Now, this debt is issued under different laws. Some are issued under domestic law, some is issued under international law, and it has different instruments that it has been issued under. And this is more dense slide for anybody who's interested what the composition of the debt is. And we owe some to the World Bank, the multilateral agencies, the ADB. We owe some to countries, and some of it is commercial debt. So I want to show that this is a debt attribution analysis that shows you how the debt has grown over a period of time. Most of the reason why the debt has grown is due to interest. Right? It's the compounding of interest. And since I'm addressing a bunch of scientists, one of the greatest scientists was Albert Einstein, and he said that compound interest is one of man's greatest inventions. Compound interest is a great thing when you are a saver, because it's interest on interest and it grows. But it is the most destructive tool when you are a borrower, basically, because the interest is compounding. And that is what has happened to Sri Lanka. It is the interest that is killing us, basically. We're getting buried by this debt mountain. And this attribution analysis shows you what is going on. I give you 50 years after independence in 1998, our total debt basically was 1 trillion. In 2023, within 2 months, we'll add a trillion. That is the rate at which the debt is accumulating. This is another attribution analysis relative to GDP. I'm going to skip this for the moment and want to show you this, that in terms of the interest, we have so much of interest because the debt is so big. It's almost 6% of GDP, which is one of the highest interest to GDPs in the world. So there are countries with large amounts of debt, more than us, but the interest rates are low because they can afford. So, for example, the interest rates in Japan are like 0.1% and 0.2%. In Sri Lanka, the interest rates are 30%. The interest relative to the size of the economy is huge. So you don't have much money. And if you look at our debt to GDP, it's like 130%. For a middle-income country like us, the red line is at about 70%, and we are already at about 130%. And relative to the debt is something like 13 times our tax revenue. Right? It used to be 6. And something like called the gross financing needs, because we have so much of debt, and the majority of the debt is getting shorter and shorter, that you have to keep on refinancing all the time. So we can't stretch it over a period of time, and it's coming due every week basically, and that is creating huge amount of pressure on the borrowing of the government, which is getting fed into the whole banking system. So for any kind of economic growth, you have to have low cost of funds. Maybe 35 years ago, if you look at banking sector credit, 10% went to the government, 90% went to the private sector. Today, the government is taking 55%, the private sector is only taking 45%. So your entire savings that is in the banking sector is not going to the productive private sector, it's all going to the government sector. Because as I said, it's going to pay debt which is getting compounded, debt on debt, and we're getting buried basically under this. So let's look at what has driven growth in Sri Lanka, economic growth. This is an attribution analysis over 7 years that shows you what economic growth has been. It has only been 2.5%, 2.2% average annual economic growth. And this shows you the sectors in which they are growing. So there are some fast growing sectors, which is in the dark blue, which are sectors that I call leading sectors. But you can see that they are very small. The contribution, the x-axis it's the size of GDP, the proportion of GDP. The y-axis is at what rate it's growing at, the compound annual growth rate. And you have new sectors like IT, etc., which you can see is growing very fast, but still very small because it employs small number of people relative to. But you can see the middle, which is where your brownfield industries, where majority of the people are employed. And there you have a serious issue with productivity because the growth is very low. So those are what are called, some of these are called tradable sectors. And there's a misplaced concept in Sri Lanka that we have to have our own industries and indigenous industries. But what is happening is that we are protecting these people, but they are not being competitive because they are not being exposed to international competition, and they are exploiting the Sri Lankan consumer at their benefit. So every business needs inputs from somebody else. And if you cannot source internationally, you're never going to be able to export. It's an oxymoronic thing saying that you can export and protect your domestic industry. It just doesn't work like that. So this chart shows you, a tree chart shows you where the sectors are. And you can see the blue sectors is a majority of your GDP. And you'll be surprised that things like wholesale trade and retail trade and transportation, these are your big sectors where you have large number of people. So in terms of when they do the labor survey, there's about 8.5 million people in Sri Lanka in the labor force. There's almost 500,000 people basically in the transport sector. Because as per their survey, there's about 350,000 people driving trishaws full time. There's about 1 million trishaws in Sri Lanka, but not everybody is a full-time trishaw driver. So the proportion of people relative to the total labor force is very high. So there are lots of people in Sri Lanka trapped in low productivity jobs. And this shows you what is happening to GDP. So the top line shows you nominal because of very, very high inflation that is going on in Sri Lanka. But the bottom line shows you real growth adjusted for inflation. And you can see that the growth is very, very slow. So last year, the economy contracted at 9%. This year, it's expected to contract 2%. And next year, only a very flat recovery. So how we come out of this crisis is going to be the critical issue because we have to grow and we have to grow fast. We have to fix all the wrong things that we did so that we create a platform for high economic growth. If not, for generations to come, we will just stagnate as a country. So this is another chart showing sectorially that which are the sectors, but you can see the industrial sector because there is a big contraction in the construction sector, which is going to be distressed for many, many years. And that was a big contributor that it is in lot of stress. So now I come to the meat of connecting innovation with economic growth. There are two things that need to happen for economic growth. One is that you have to employ more people. The second thing is the output per person you have to increase. So the output per person, how you can increase is you put more capital intensity so that a person uses a machine so that, for example, a farmer without using a buffalo replaces the buffalo with a tractor, which has a much higher productivity and therefore they can get higher output. Or what you do is total factor productivity, which is how much of inputs you put, the transformation of inputs in the output, how can you improve that input output ratio? And you take in all inputs, capital, land, labor, all of that. And that's why it's called total factor productivity. Now, in order to improve total factor productivity, there are three things that have to happen. One is that you have to improve the skill level of your people. Second is the technological progress. And the third thing is the economic restructuring, which is also very important because you need to have a lot of competition to change the way you do things. That the way your businesses are organized, your industries are organized, there are sometimes better ways of organizing things that will improve better performance. And all of these three things require competition. Competition is the key driver of capitalism. So what you see on the left side is what most of you may think what business in Sri Lanka is. But the reality is the people on the right side are the majority of your business. So there was a survey done by the Department of Census and Statistics in 2014, and it showed in that survey there were 3 million establishments. Out of the 3 million established, 92% of these establishments had 4 people or less. These are called micro entrepreneurs. And out of the 1 million of these establishments, they employed 3 million people. 45% of these people work for these small micro enterprises. So generally, the larger companies are more productive because they have scale, they can do more complex products, you have specialists in different areas. The small micro enterprises basically, they're at a subsistence level. So what are these? So your cobbler and your butcher and your hairdresser and a lot of these people, a lot of them in service economy. Now it doesn't mean that they cannot improve their productivity, but the reality is that is the reflection of our economy. That is where majority of the people are employed. And the one I was telling about the labor participation, the other problem that we have is that the female labor participation rate is very low at 35%. This is a very South Asian phenomenon. In Bangladesh, it's higher because they have a big representation in the apparel sector. But most of South Asia, due to cultural reasons and other reasons, the female labor participation rate is very low. So one country, if you look at, which is beating the hell out of us, is Vietnam. Their female labor participation rate is 70 to 80%, one of the highest in the world, basically. And ours is only 35%, while the male participation rate is about 70%. So if we are going to create new jobs, and we will have to create about 1 million new jobs, you will have to create a lot of jobs for the females. The next problem that we have is a majority of our labor force is not employed in the formal sector. They're employed in the informal sector. So the majority of the employees are in the informal sector. They're not in formal enterprises. So the first challenge is doing more with less. Where is the confluence of economics with engineering? Economics is a study of the use of scarce resources which have alternate uses. Resources are scarce where there is not enough to satisfy all human desires, and all resources have multiple uses. Quite simply, knowing what to use and where to use in order to create most value is economics. Economics is a study of productivity. So, economics and engineering have a confluence because both sciences basically is a study of constraint optimization. That in engineering, basically, you have certain technical constraints and you have to work within those technical constraints. Similarly, in economics, that resources and endowments are limited, that you have limited amount of money. So how do you allocate that limited amount of money to resources which have scarcity and have alternate uses? So in what Adam Smith talked about 300 years ago is the hidden hand of the market, basically, through the pricing mechanism, figures out this whole coordination dilemma. You don't have government doing it, it just happens automatically. And that is why to come out of this crisis, we have to engage the market economy and allow the market to help us make these decisions. So there are 4 types of innovation that you can have. You can have product, you can have process, you can have a paradigm business model, and position innovation. So doing more with less. If you take agricultural productivity, it's very low. So just take, for example, coconut, right? There is, I believe, more than 50 million coconut trees in Sri Lanka. It occupies over 20% of the arable land, and we produce about 3 billion coconuts. The last 2 years, actually last year has been an extremely good year for coconuts. While tea and rubber came down, the output came down, coconut output actually went up. But the problem is that a coconut tree in Sri Lanka has only 65 nuts. And with the right kind of caretaking, you could get that average above 100. And there are coconut trees in Sri Lanka, in certain estates, which already do that. So the knowledge that you need is already in the country, but the dissipation is insufficient. So take rubber, the average is basically only 900 kilos per hectare. But if you look at all our Southeast Asian neighbors, they have over 1,500 kilograms per hectare, right? So if they can do it, why not us? And even in Sri Lanka, there are estates who do it. So what you have in Sri Lanka is you have a head end, which is best practice, high-end productivity, and a very long tail. And one of the problems with agriculture is, for example, the coconut estates are all owned by people in Colombo 7. And they never visit it, basically. So, the best fertilizer for any agriculture are the footsteps of the owner. You can't do agriculture with the owner sitting in Colombo, basically, and doing it part-time. So, there is a huge productivity imperative in this country. And I'm hoping that the market system will incentivize people, because through the pricing mechanism, that is how it works. So this is the famous Toyota production system, that there are 7 types of waste. I'm not going to go through it, but we have to think through this less waste, higher productivity paradigm. And some of the presentations people were making were touching on reducing some of these wastes, etc. And that's one way of how to improve productivity. So I'll give you another example, doing less, more with less. This is a real life example. These photographs are not necessarily from Sri Lanka, but this is a story of Celtel versus Dialog, which was like 25, 30 years ago. Celtel didn't have money. Dialog had a rich parent. Dumi Ratnayaka was one of the CEOs. He was a Moratoa graduate, etc. So he said, look, I don't have enough money. I had to put cell phone towers. So I'll make it with 3 legs. Now, somebody who understands basic physics, you understand the static stability problem, that you could do it for this. But it was not the engineering necessity, but the economic necessity that created the need to do this. He said, I didn't have the money. So I had to make 1 rupee look like 2. So this is where for the scientists and engineers in this country, if there was ever an opportunity, this is the best decade. Because we can't afford to waste resources. And all these terrible policies that the government has been doing in distorting every market, they can't do this anymore. They have to stop all this. So the opportunity for innovation and looking for substitutes is massive. The commercial paradigm is going to be significantly high. Finding substitutes. This shows you the import balance. The red is energy. So from the 20 billion, about 4 billion is spent on energy. That is a single largest import. Now, first of all, it is absolutely crazy that your single largest import is mispriced. You're giving it away too cheap. People are overusing it. So you would have seen this Jana lipper. Lots of people came up with different lippers, basically. But this guy came up with. So LP gas is over 5,000 rupees a cylinder. So imported energy. Of course, there's convenience, all this. But can you find... I mean, people have been working on this, it's not new, but I'm just demonstrating, connecting the economics with the alternatives. Oh. Make volume in. Can you put the volume?
Yes, hi. So I'm Riyad Ismail, thank you so well. And this is the Janalipa. This is 100% Sri Lankan innovation by me. As you can see, I have the Sri Lankan patent for this stove, as well as many national awards and accolades for this stove invention for science and technology. So today we are going to introduce this stove to you all, which is actually a product that emulates gas. So gas, then ganan gas ne Lankawe. ඉතින් ඒ නිසා මේ ලිප ඉතාමත්ම gas භාවිතය වෙනුවෙන් මේක නිර්මාණය කරපු ලිපක්. ඉතින් මම අද මේ ලිපේ විශේෂත්වය පොඩ්ඩක් පෙන්නන්න යනවා. I'm going to show the difference. This is a cast iron peanut chutney piece, which is alone 5 kilos in weight, and this is where you put the පොකටු වඟුරු වදර කෑලි. ඉතින් මේකේ ඕනෙම උෂ්ණත්වයක් මේකේ දරා ගන්න පුළුවන්. ඉතින් අනිත් ලිපයුම් තියෙනවා ලාභ ලිපයුම් මේ කෑල්ල මැටි වලින් හදලා තියෙනවා. ඒ කෑල්ල පොකටු වඟුරු වල රසණයට ඔරොත්තු දෙන්නේ නැහැ. මාසෙකින් පමණ කැඩිලා බිඳිලා යනවා. ඉතින් මේක ඉතාමත් සුරක්ෂිතයි. ඕනෙම උෂ්ණත්වයක් දරා ගන්න පුළුවන් මැටි කෑල්ල. ඒ වගේම මේක ඉතාමත්ම ශක්තිමත් රිෆ්‍රැක්ටරි ක්ලේ වලින් හදපු මැටීරියල් වලින් හදලා තියෙන්නේ. මේක කිලෝ 100ක් වුණත් බර මේ අතට දරා ගන්න පුළුවන්. මම ගිය සැරේ වීඩියෝ එකේ මේක උඩ හිටගෙන පෙන්නුවා. අද එහෙම කරන්නේ නැහැ. ඉතින් ඒ නිසා මේ ලිපේ ටෝටල් බර කිලෝ 10ක් වෙනවා. ඒ කියන්නේ ඉතාමත්ම ශක්තිමත් ලිපක්. ඒ ශක්තියක් තමයි මේකේ උෂ්ණත්වය අඩු වැඩි කරන්න පුළුවන්. මේ ලිපේ මේ ස්විච් එකෙන් මේ එකට දැම්මොත් අඩු හීට් එක, නැද දැම්මොත් ඔෆ්, මේ දෙකට දැම්මොත් ෆුල් රස්නේ ගන්න පුළුවන් මේ ලිපේ. ඒ වගේම මේ දැන් අපේ ඉලෙක්ට්‍රිසිටි ගියා ගෙදර. ඒ නිසා මේ ලිප මේ වගේ ෆෝන් බැටරි බෑකප් එකක් එක්ක මේක දරස් එකේ ගන්න පුළුවන් මේ කන්වර්ටරේ. ඒක ගහලා අද අපි මේකෙන් මේ ලිප පත්තු කරන්න යනවා. හැබැයි මේ ලිප ගද්දී අපි මේ පවර් පැක් එක දෙනවා. මේ ලිපත් එක්ක මේක මේ ප්ලග් එකට ගහලා පාවිච්චි.
Okay, so I'm going to just skip it because I'm running out of time. But the thing is that on LPG gas, we spend over half a billion dollars on imports. So it's a big item. So my argument is that, and I'll give you my argument. Now you have diesel, single largest import item for my HS code, over $1.5 billion, over $1.5 billion, right? There's a concept called biodiesel. This is not new. It's been there for 20, 30 years. But there is no mention when the politicians talk, they say we have to hold the price of diesel down because the poor man, basically, he's using buses. Total diesel consumption in passenger transports in Sri Lanka is 30%. So other 70% has other uses. Now, India has a target, put 20% of diesel indigenously produced biodiesel. So you make vegetable oils, right? So the advantage is you can only do this if you keep the price up, right? Because the incentives will not work otherwise. The thing is that if you start incentivizing biodiesel production in the country, you don't import it, and that value goes to your domestic economy. It will stimulate a lot of domestic activity. Okay. So we have to again embrace the market mechanism to find solutions. If you tax something, you will have less of it. If you subsidize something, you will have more of it. And our problem is more. I'm going to skip this. There's another form of innovation which is business model. So in the hospitality landscape, there are 4 offerings. You have hotels, you have resorts, you have apartments and homestays. These are all forms of lodging. And you ask yourself, when a tourist comes to Sri Lanka, what do they have? Do they want a destination or a room for the night? Because they want to go out and enjoy the beach, etc. So they don't want to pay too much for it. And what the new informal sector, which is the largest part of our tourism infrastructure, out of the total inventory of hotel rooms in Sri Lanka, over 50% of it are from establishments with less than 20 rooms. So it's not these kind of hotels that provide the majority of room inventory. It's all the small guys, right? And to show you the business innovation, that perhaps 15 years ago, 10 years ago, you had these vertical search engines like Airbnb, Booking.com. So what they started doing is they started solving the problem of the small guy. He could never be found, he or she. If you have 5 rooms, how are you going to signal? If you are a Hilton or Sheraton, you can signal. You're big, you have size, you can advertise. What do you do with the small guy? How is he going to be found? You know, those days in UK, like 50 years ago, they used to have Automobile Association magazine, and you would say bed and breakfast person, and you can update it once a year or once every 2 years. That's how you would signal. Somebody has to look through the magazine. Today, using these platforms, because they allow you to come on the platform for free, right? So people can find you. And then you are reluctant to go because you don't know the quality. But the guy who stayed in the hotel before you is giving you a review. They have photographs. You have real-time discovery of the price of the room. So here you have an entire ecosystem, business ecosystem that enable the long tail in Sri Lanka's tourism. And I'll show you this. The left chart shows you the number of establishments in 2013. The right chart shows you the number of establishments in 2018. So look at the density, how it grew, and it went into new places that previously did not have offerings. So business model innovation also has to play a large role. And I suggest that in your competition that you also allow some kind of competition for business model innovation. Very quickly, this is my last area, that there is something called the Scrabble theory of economic development. So what these professors from Harvard, Ricardo Hausman, says is that your ability to do things is like the Scrabble. That the developing countries have few letters, few competencies. The developed countries have multiple competencies. They have more letters of the Scrabble board, and they have the rare letters. So the developing countries can only make simple products because they have few letters. The developed countries have multiple capabilities, so they can make complex products. And they characterize this as the economic complexity index. Right? So they analyze countries' export basket and see what they can do. So his theory is you can't acquire those competencies because a lot of those competencies are tacit knowledge. You can't read it off a book. It's by doing, repetition, imitation that you learn. And the best analogy I can give you is in cooking. You can look at a recipe book, but you can't do it exactly until you see somebody else doing, and he or she is showing you by imitation, repetition, how to get it right. So under the economic complexity index, this chart shows you basically the number of entities who can make these simple products, which is the x-axis. And the y-axis is showing you that the more complicated products, how many entities can produce those. So if a lot of people can produce it, it becomes commoditized. You can't get a high price premium for a product that many people can make. But complex products, where few people can make, you can extract a large price premium. And that's how your income increases. So this shows you the economic complexity index of Sri Lanka. And it is showing you other countries. And we are going nowhere. Right? So because we don't have that knowledge in the country, tacit knowledge. So this is, and we have to come out of this crisis by exporting. The top line shows the bottom line. Let's start at the bottom. The contribution of the export sector to economic growth in Sri Lanka. It's very, very small. So unlike our Southeast Asian neighbors, we did not grow in the post-conflict era by exporting. We grew by building white elephant projects and stimulating the domestic economy. But look at the middle, Vietnam. Big contribution to economic growth through exports. Exports means you're competitive, you're selling to the world market. And one of the problems of Sri Lanka is, look at the line about Sri Lanka. In this 15 years that the study was done, the number of new products that we added to our export basket, its contribution was abysmal. Only 300 million, so we were exporting about $11 billion. Only $300 million came from 15 new products that we added in the last 15 years. Look at the performance of Vietnam. All the growth came from new products. This is Thailand. Look at the export performance on the left. They also import a lot of stuff. They export a lot to Asia. They import a lot from Asia. This is Vietnam. You can see that there's a blue that has just exploded. What do you think that is? What do you think it is? Mobile phones. Because Samsung has these huge factories because they want to go to China, they'll copy them. They didn't even have that industry. But you can see they're importing a lot also. So they import a lot and they export a lot. Now they're importing from Asia and they're exporting to Asia. And these are the value chains which I will show you. This is Sri Lanka. We're going nowhere. But we're importing like anything. Of course, what's missing here is we exported our people. And the people send back remittances and that's driving the imports. The tacit knowledge. Right? These are the major cities in the world. They have a lot of immigrants in them. I don't know how many immigrants are in Colombo City. The immigrants are bringing this tacit knowledge. Right? So, international stock of migrants in the country, you can see Sri Lanka very, very small. But our diaspora relative to our population very high. So we are fine exporting our people but not very good at importing other people. No, don't come here. But we have a lot of people overseas. This is the number of Sri Lankans in the OECD countries. So the question is, can you exploit that tacit knowledge which I talked about? Can you attract them back where they will bring this tacit knowledge and create these new industries that we need? Not only do they have to bring the knowledge, but they have to bring the networks, the marketing, the relationships. Lastly, there is a complete misunderstanding saying that we have to add value in Sri Lanka to our own raw materials. This is a completely wrong thing. Because value addition basically is based on value chains. You cannot do everything here. If you mine your graphite, you can't make, Tesla batteries, and I've seen all this nonsense being talked. It's nonsense. This is a Boeing aircraft. Many of you may have seen this. The parts are coming from all over the place. So you can be very big doing a very small thing in a very large industry, which is what we should focus on. We should do a lot of stuff that we don't do here. Small value addition, but large market. On that, I have exceeded my time. I hope I have given you a context how to think about the challenge of Sri Lanka coming out of this crisis and why economics has to play, especially the market economy has to work for innovation to work. Because if you don't have the market economy, which is giving you the scarcity value and the incentives and capitalism to make innovation succeed, all the inventing in the lab is not going to work. On that note, I will end. Thank you.